Hey there. Today, we're diving into something that feels, well, totally set in stone, logic itself. But as we're about to find out, the very rules we use for reasoning have a wild story of their own, a journey from a kind of philosophical art form to a hardcore science. So let's trace the evolution of how we think.
So, let's kick things off with a kind of mind-bending question. What if the fundamental rules of thinking weren't some timeless truth, but have actually changed and even multiplied over the centuries? Sounds crazy, right? But believe it or not, that's pretty much what happened. We see logic as this rigid, unchanging thing, but its history is just so surprisingly dynamic.
Okay, so to get a grip on where logic is today, we've got to go way back to the beginning. In its earliest form, logic wasn't about formulas or symbols or anything like that. It was way more fluid, more philosophical. It was simply the art of thinking.
In this quote from Hegel, it's really the key to understanding that starting point. He didn't see philosophy as a dusty book of answers, but as the process of deliberately thinking about stuff. It was this active, disciplined reflection that was kind of the fertile ground where logic first started to grow.
So you get it, right? Early logic was a verb. It was something you did. It was this constant cycle of reflecting on an idea, asking sharp questions, and then actively hunting for answers. It was a creative, intellectual adventure, really.
But, this kind of free-flowing art of thinking was about to get a massive update. Because when Aristotle shows up on the scene, he basically says, hey, if we're all going to reason together, we need a shared set of rules. And this was a total game changer.
So what did Aristotle do that was so brilliant? He totally zeroed in on the idea of proof. He argued that logic wasn't just about exploring ideas. It was about building a rock-solid argument to prove a conclusion. And in doing that, he basically built the first ever instruction manual for how to reason correctly.
And his killer app for this? The syllogism. It's so elegant, so simple. You start with a big general truth, right? Like, all humans are mortal. Then you throw in a specific fact. Socrates is a human. And from just those two things, you can draw a conclusion that's basically undeniable. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. For the very first time, humanity had a universal recipe for making a solid point.
Okay, so once Aristotle laid down these rules, logic was on a whole new path. The hunt for absolute certainty and rigor was on, and it started pushing logic out of the big, general world of philosophy and molding it into something more structured, something more powerful, something that looked a lot more like a science.
And this little phrase right here, it just perfectly nails what was happening. Logic, which was basically philosophy's kid, was all grown up now, becoming its own distinct scientific thing.
The philosopher of Leibniz actually gave us a fantastic way to picture this. He said, hey, think of all knowledge like a tree. The main trunk, that's metaphysics, the core of all philosophy. But sprouting out from that trunk are all these different branches. You got one for physics, one for biology, and, you guessed it, a big, strong branch just for logic. It was now its own science, still connected to philosophy, but with its own tools and its own goals.
So, let's just hit pause for a second and really look at this shift. The whole point of logic changed from this open-ended inquiry to structured proof. The way you did it went from personal reflection to formal rigor. And logic itself went from being this dynamic, creative art to a formal science. This was a massive change in what people even thought logic was for.
But hold on, the story is far from over. The next revolution was brewing, and it was about to give logic a brand new, super-powered language, math.
And look, this wasn't just some dusty academic debate. Our sources call it a struggle for survival and scientific progress. All these paradoxes and weird uncertainties were popping up in math, and they desperately needed a form of logic that was absolutely bulletproof. I mean, scientific progress itself was on the line.
And the hero of this chapter, a guy named Gottlob Frege. His first big move was to rip logic away from human psychology. He said, look, logic isn't about how our messy human brains happen to think, with all our mistakes and biases. No. He wanted to find the universal laws of truth that exist out there, totally separate from us. And by using the precise language of math, he turned logic into a truly objective search for abstract, perfect structures. And that brings us pretty much up to today. Now, you'd think making logic all scientific and strict would be the end of the line, right? Game over. But what's so cool is that the exact opposite happened. All that rigor is what allowed logic to just explode into this amazing, diverse new world. And I absolutely love this metaphor. We went from this black and white idea that there's just one single universal logic with a capital L to a colored view.
Today, we get that different fields might actually need different kinds of logic. The logic you use in quantum physics might not be the same one you use in computer programming or in ethics. Logic became less of a rule book and more of a versatile toolkit.
So let's just quickly recap this amazing journey, shall we? We started way back in ancient Greece with logic as this fluid art of thinking. Then Aristotle came along and gave it bones, gave it structure, with the idea of proof. Centuries later, guys like Leibniz helped it split off and become its own science. Then Frege came in and gave it rocket fuel with mathematics, which brings us to today, a world with not just one logic, but a whole rainbow of them. I mean, the very blueprint for how we think has been erased and redrawn over and over again.
And that leaves us with one last, really fascinating thought. We've just seen how the absolute bedrock of reason has shifted and evolved through time. So what does that mean for us, right now? What totally unbreakable rules of thinking that we take for granted today might just be another chapter in a story that's still being written? Thanks for sticking with me on this one.